Viktor, the stage is yours. Thanks for coming. Thanks for being with us.
Hey, thank you. Thank you for having me here. Slides are visible, I guess. Slide?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So let me start. So the question that we will discuss is, should we give up on large organizations? And let me ask the way we're going to approach this one. So the way I'm going to talk about this question is that we'll approach it from a much more personal point of view. So how do individuals we are standing in a job? So the first one is maybe also the most crucial one. So imagine that you are 90 years old and you look back at your working life. What do you see back? What do you actually want to see back? And what did you achieve? You have been working for a big chunk of your life. What exactly have you done? So it's a bit a rhetorical question, but just to set a stage to give you a bit of an idea what we're going to talk about. So there is this guy, David Graeber, and quite some time ago, he wrote an essay, and this essay became very viral. So the people recognize themselves enormously in the essay. So it's about this notion of a bullshit job. And so some of you are probably familiar with it because it was so popular. And after the essay, he did quite a lot of research by asking people to send all kinds of information about their own jobs and how they experienced that. And based on that, he wrote a whole book. And it's an interesting book. His writing style is also quite funny and interesting, and get you to think about stuff a lot. And so the main problem that he explains in the book extensively is that we, in the past many decades, we have achieved a huge amount of efficiency and productivity in our work. Lots of stuff has been automated. So logically, you would think that we have much less work to do because lots of stuff is done much, much better, much more efficiently. So what do we do with our times? Well, after all these decades of efficiency, we are still basically working and maybe in some way even working even more. And now begs the question, what exactly are we doing then? What kind of jobs are we now executing? And what proves to be is that there are lots of jobs is just bullshit, basically, and it doesn't have much of a purpose whatsoever. In fact, this is not some kind of a claim. This is coming from the people themselves who talk about their own jobs. So 40% of Dutch and 37% of British workers, according to a survey done in both countries, say their job has no good reason to exist. And I'm pretty sure this is not the case only in Netherlands and UK. I think it's a widespread problem. And so if 40% of these people feel their job actually shouldn't exist, what about the people who, the rest of them, are they all meaningful jobs, or it begs the question, how many don't really know their job has no good reason to exist? So just to be clear, when I say bullshit job, I don't mean a shitty job. And so somebody cleaning the toilets might be a shitty job, but it's absolutely not a bullshit one. It's a very, very useful job. And so we need to be very clear about that. So, but it begs the question, so what the heck is exactly a bullshit job? Can you give me some examples of types? So we're going to talk about the types, each of them. And I'm going to put those, so just to be clear, I'm not going to talk about this book. You better read the book yourself. I will project this book in a product development in a typical less situation. And so how does it reflect the less adoptions, basically? And how does it look like? What do we do about it? So the first one is the flunkies. And so the flunkies are people who make superiors look more important. So all kinds of assistants, and I've seen in IT world, especially people who are helping their superiors to do all kinds of activities or projects which the superior themselves doesn't have time for it because they have more important things to do. And sometimes they're called project managers. They're not really having some kind of a real project with the people working in a project, but it's just a project, it's some kind of assignment given by the superior, and they call it project, and therefore they are project manager. And so it's a kind of a special type of project manager. It's very painful to see this, because I've noticed personally these people interacting with the superiors, and the type of jobs they're getting is quite often completely useless, but they have to give something to those project managers to do, because the whole purpose of the job is to make the superior feel more important, basically. There isn't really a real reason. Second one is goons. And considering the problems in organization, with especially with the, for example, budgeting, the goons are weirdly important. Without a goon, you might have an even bigger problem. What is a goon? Is somebody who's actually fighting other goons, in order to get, for example, budget approval, because there is a certain amount of budget that can be spread across multiple product development groups. So each of these goons needs to get as much budget as possible, so they can do the work that they want to do. And so typically how it looks like, they create these very sleek PPTs, and they have a huge personal network with the superiors in order to get the budget around. So I remember in one of the less adoptions, we still had a program manager in less adoption. So it's really weird. Normally, you don't have a program manager in a less adoption, but this program manager didn't run any kind of a program. It was basically every year making sure there is enough budget to keep paying the teams in a less adoption. Next one is duct tapers. This one is much more common in the IT industry than in other industries. So they are people who are fixing the problems, but they are not really fixing it permanently. So typically first and second line support, and or code mergers. Actually, my first experience in a large product development with quite a lot of teams is there was this merger guy. What does it mean? It means that every team, even developers, they develop in their own branches. So this all needs to come into the trunk. So you could have a continuous integration by having people continuously integrate. And one of the very common practices in less, not only less, in a generally agile world. Or you can have one individual doing continuous integration. Can you imagine that? So I was that individual. I was full-time, basically taking the branches and the code from different people, different teams, and looking at the code deeply and trying to make a sense out of it, and then merging it. And it worked quite okay, except that I was spending lots of time to figure out what the heck people did. And occasionally it didn't work, so I need to go to talk to people to see what the heck did they actually create in the code. So then I would be able to merge it. So it was a full-time job, merging stuff together. I was basically a duct taper. I didn't produce anything. I was just simply doing something which only exists because the real problem is not solved. There was no real continuous integration. I bet you never heard of a single person continuous integration practice before. Box tickers. And so people who are doing the certain tasks, activities, simply because it has to be done. And it's a form of reporting or whatever. And so a common one is the Agile maturity level assessors. They call themselves Agile coaches. And most of the time what they do is they go team by team, and they need to assess the teams, whether they comply, whether they achieve certain maturity level. And if they haven't achieved what they need to do in order to achieve it. And they report this in a very nice, cool looking graphs, which they show trends, how the teams are progressing. And so I would ask them, these Agile coaches, so is this useful to the teams? And so they would say, yes, the team says they're useful. So I go to teams, I ask the teams, is this useful to you, these Agile maturity level assessments? And so the team would say, oh, yes. And then I would ask, why is it useful? Well, if we achieve a certain level, it's going to look really good in the management eyes and the eyes of other teams. So that's why it's useful to us. So then we have taskmasters. So they manage or create extra work. So the Michael James has coined them team output owners. So it's a pretty good term. But another term for the same is the taskmasters. So basically, this massive army of so-called product owners, which are basically so-called product owner for a component team, and each of the component teams, and these teams are doing some partial work. The product owner doesn't have any authority on a real product. They're basically being told by somebody in charge what the team should be focusing on, and then they translate that into the tasks. So they're taskmaster basically, and so those tasks they put it in Jira, and then make sure team is actually executing that. So why is this a bullshit job? Simply because it cannot be that all the components are equally important. So if one of the components doesn't need to be changed, this taskmaster still needs to create tasks for the team to execute. Otherwise, team has nothing to do. And that's usually an unacceptable situation. So they're just creating those tasks. So now begs the question, so quite a few of these people participating in this kind of a system where there's lots of bullshit and the bullshit jobs, they are smart, and they might be really not amused by this. You probably also recognize the situation that I talk about. So what do smart people do in those situations? It's quite interesting. So some of them, one is a friend of mine. He a long time ago, he had assignment in a very large company, and so there was basically almost nothing to do for him. And so instead of doing all kinds of nonsense, he was reading Wikipedia all day long, every day, for a very long time, actually. And then I had in the less adoption managers who still retained their position, and what they were doing, they're reading the books. And I also know quite a few developers who were open source contributors, and so they're contributing to some kind of open source project. Really good. It's actually a very smart way of spending your time. Much better than executing some task, which is or activity, which is part of a bullshit job. And at least you learn a lot and gain some experience, because learning generally can hardly be called bullshit, and even if you get paid for it. So what happens when what's the output of a bullshit jobs? So in product development specifically. So you get more of it. So you you have the existing bullshit jobs, they create new ones, additional ones, and they're typically called chapter managers and train engineers, epic owners, business owners, program consultant, and so on and so on. So it's an endless stream, all kinds of a cool terminology, and it seems to change gradually over the years, the terminology, but the essence remains more or less the same. So this begs the question, how is it possible that existing bullshit jobs create more bullshit jobs? It has to do with the distance from the Gemba. So the further you are from the actual product development, the more likely you are going to create more bullshit jobs. Why is that? Is because one manager who has a problem, let's say, I don't know, who's responsible for some kind of a big chunk of work and that needs to be done. We maybe call epic. And previously it was called project, now it's called epic for whatever reason. And then somebody needs to make sure that happens properly. They don't really know how to have teams being responsible for a large chunks of work. So they need to have somebody who's actually making sure that that happens properly. That's the best they can do, simply because they are not so close to the product development. And so they appoint a person which needs to make sure that happens. So just to be clear, appointing a person that makes sure that something happens means the person is not going to actually make it happen. They just need to be responsible for it. And that's how then the bullshit gets recreated again. And then you have lots of practices. The very common one is offshoring, core of product development. And then surprisingly, what you notice that the better paid bullshit work actually remains in the company. So the actual useful work gets offshored. So it's something really weird, and that's like not only product development, it's basically recognized in many industries, is that that the pressure for efficiency and for lower cost is on the non-bullshit work. It's never actually, or rarely, on the actual bullshit jobs. And so rarely organizations talk about the efficiency of the managers. They talk about the efficiency of the workers. And then maybe some of you remember, if you've been in IT for some time, is you used to have a code generation tools because coding was considered expensive. It's a typical output of this kind of a thinking. And then obsession with efficiency and developers and team productivity, and so-called team performance, a concept which doesn't actually exist in product development, the performance of a team. You cannot measure performance of a team. That's not possible simply. And because the team is not working in a factory where you can measure how much output did they produce. And but still everybody seems to be talking about the team performance and how do we measure that, and especially compare teams to each other. And even co-creator of Scrum talks about in half the time, double the work or something like that. And then you have what also creates is more doers. And so the people basically execute without questioning or ability to question the bullshit. And so you have this huge system where it's almost impossible to do something about it. Even talking about it, people are then labeled as complainers and etc. So should we just give up on big? Does it? Yeah, I mean, if I talk about this, I can imagine, get depressed about it. No. So now I'm going to switch into the more mode. What do we do about it, and how do we look at this problem? So the first one, we need to be aware of the choice many developers in organizations make, and probably yourself also have had to make this choice. Is choice between. It's obviously a scale, but let's make it simpler. The choice between, but there is also something in between. So you choose for a small company. And typically, smaller companies tend to have a more meaningful work, simply because not doing meaningful work means being bankrupt. So you have to produce some product which is useful to the users, and users are willing to pay for it, or the customer is willing to pay for it. And you're also more likely to learn meaningful stuff. Simply because diversity of learning is higher, the work tends to be less specialized. There is no luxury of being very specialized in one area. And on the other hand, you have a corporate world, which provides typically higher salary, especially in the banking. Just to take one industry, and a certain career path. You have a certain steps, and so you're looking ahead a number of years from now, and you see yourself becoming a manager. So why people become a developer in corporate investment banking is because there is a high chance to become a trader, which pays much more. They are not really into the software development. More in career path. So corporate world is very optimized for advancing into bullshit, and so because that pays better, and so advancing away from the development, let's say. And when I say developer, I'm not mean coding. I mean directly contributing to delivery of a customer product. And so this is the dilemma for many people. And which one do you choose? And obviously, they are not always mutually exclusive, but for many people, they seemingly are. Especially in Asia, being in a corporate world and having a label of a manager, it means that you made it, and you want to go back to family and say, "Hey," to a grandma, when a grandma asks, "So, have you managed now to become a manager?" And if you still need to say no, you feel like a loser. They sometimes even consider you a loser. So yeah, and that's a choice to make. Choose one. And so this begs the question: do we say then don't go into corporate world? Well, that would be nonsense. Simply because most people are in a corporate world. So the target is mainly this corporate world full of dysfunction and the bullshit jobs. What do we do about it? How do we actually? We want to have a cookie and eat it too. You want to actually have a corporate role which is more healthy, and how much more, I don't know, but we need to go in that direction. And that's what the less comes into place. So there are many reasons to choose for less. I wanted to explain this reason. It's a very personal one. It's also a tool, a way to reduce amount of bullshit. Why would you do that? Because we people don't really have a satisfied life by, no, let me rephrase it. I really believe that everybody, when you're 90 years old, you want to look back at your life. The answer that you want to have is that you did something meaningful, that you did something which contributes to others, contributes to the world, that has a meaning. And so that's what we really want. Unfortunately, too many of us are going to work simply because you have to have a work, and because you have to have a money, and you're going to work so that you can have a really nice private life, basically. That's unfortunate, considering how much time we spend in our work. So let me dig immediately into what probably many of us in the list and participants here are, is Agile Coach or Scrum Master. And I'm going to point the unfortunate realization of how much of an Agile Coach and Scrum Master is a bullshit. So which is very ironic if you think about it. Our job is to actually reduce the bullshit, and instead many of us contributing to the bullshit. So one of them is that I too often hear Scrum Master saying, I'm responsible for people stuff, or a manager saying, my Scrum Master is for the people stuff. And that's the job of a Scrum Master in process. And so the process is simply incorrect. The Scrum Master is absolutely not responsible for the process. And it's a very common misconception. The team is responsible for the process. Scrum Master is just helping the team to improve the process. And so the people stuff, it's not that it's bad, it's just simply that when somebody says, and it shows they're all into the people stuff, they typically also don't really understand how product development works. So they're overemphasizing how important the people are in order to compensate for the fact they don't really understand product development. And despite it, it's so they try to make people happy in the teams, or teams happy, but what happens in reality is that they're completely failing in it, because the best way to have a team to be happy is to simply get out of the way of the teams and make sure the team is doing some meaningful work, so producing actual product. So if they have a trouble doing meaningful work, then it doesn't really matter how cool stuff you introduce and all kinds of nice things and laughing and I don't know what. Meaningful work is the most important for the people to come to work, and so everything else is a side thing. So and then you have a Scrum Master. How do I make my team do blah blah blah? That's just wrong on so many levels. You don't make team do anything. And then you have in the large corporates centralized Agile coaching centers. So the people who are more busy with themselves than with the teams. Ask a Scrum Master. So are you? Does your team find you useful? Or I go to the team, do you find your Scrum Master useful? And they don't really notice much from the Scrum Master. And then I ask Scrum Master, so how does your day look like? And they say, I'm really, really busy. Well, what the heck are you busy with? And it proves to be they're busy with themselves. They created their own complete bullshit thing, and with all kinds of tasks. They even run a Scrum, where they manage their own Scrum board with their own tasks, while the team barely notices what the Scrum Masters are doing. So, which is really weird. So Agile coaches who haven't been involved in product development. So there's some Agile coaches, I don't understand that. So basically, how can you coach product development if you haven't been involved yourself? And so altogether, if you are in this situation, the best thing what you can do is learn to actively do nothing. And so what does actively do nothing means? Go on Les.work site and blog posts and find the one from Bas Fodder. He explains exactly what it means, actively doing nothing. And so the Scrum Masters really needs to learn to do nothing, because that's actually much more healthy than trying to be busy and creating illusion of contributing something. So I do realize that many of the Scrum Masters who are in this problem are junior Scrum Masters. They don't do this intentionally. They just simply don't really know how to get out of it. It takes time. The most challenging part in LeSS, and when introducing LeSS, is the impact on individuals. So essentially, when we introduce LeSS, you're exposing a lot of problems, lots of stuff. And so this impact on individuals even starts in the course, in a certified LeSS practitioner course, where some of them realize that their job is actually a bullshit one. It doesn't have much of a purpose, of a meaning. So they can perfectly exist without them. And so it takes, so after the course, more people might realize that the job is bullshit. And so they, but this takes time. It takes quite a lot of time, actually. And for them to realize, and it gradually becomes more and more painful. And so they need to make a choice. And one choice is they simply don't want to admit that. And another one is that they do admit, and the reason why they're having trouble admitting is because they are too invested in a status quo. So there is a lot to lose for them to admitting that the job is actually bullshit one. Even for Scrum Masters and product owners, etc., the so-called agile stuff. And then you also have a system within which you're working. You might admit yourself that your job is bullshit, but how do you change that? If the system doesn't allow you to change the situation, or your system is pushing very strongly in the opposite direction, it still becomes really difficult to do something about it. And so what happens is that people either change the job, so they really leave. In LeSS adoptions, it's quite common after a lot of struggle that people leave the job because they kind of try. Most of them actually say, I want to try to fit in these new situations. But some do change the job, they leave the job. And some, they change really their situation and position, etc. And when that happens, it's a very remarkable sight. People are literally becoming more happy, start to have a more fulfilling job. And that's really amazing to see. That's for me personally one of the most satisfying things in LeSS and in LeSS introductions. So you have to realize that when we introduce LeSS, what actually happens is that before LeSS adoption, there are usually already teams. Okay, but those teams tend to can be sometimes called so-called Scrum teams. They're usually not really Scrum teams. They are not really cross-functional. They might be doing development. They might be doing some testing. And so what we do in LeSS adoption, we encounter the situation where you have teams and which produce a product or separate parts of the product. And then you have a whole range of, on top of that, coordination roles, all kinds of roles. And it can be a bit agile-ish or traditional, it doesn't really matter, from project managers to Scrum Masters, which coordinate with each other, to so-called product owners, which talk to each other. And so there is a lots of back and forth discussion, coordination in above layers to make sure that something has been delivered. Also, all kinds of what we call undone departments. So people like architects and analysts and so on and so on. These are all, let's call it coordination roles to make sure that things come together at the end. And so what happens in a LeSS is basically that red line, we are pushing the line up basically. So this means that the same knowledge that is required for product development stays in organization, stays in LeSS adoption, but the people shift into the teams. Majority of the people go into the teams. So in this way, we create a new setting of feature teams where people need to work in a very different way. They don't have anymore the strict small box of a role or responsibility, but they're suddenly part of the feature team, and they need to figure out how to work together as a team, and especially in combination with other teams, without having this nice box which defines exactly what you need to do as an individual. And this creates a lot of confusion for the people. And not only confusion, it's also creating insecurity. For some of the people, they when they are architects and they suddenly become a part of the team, that's a loss of a status, and they have a trouble adjusting to that, etc., etc. So there's lots of confusion, not a very pleasant one, and it takes a long time for people to adjust. So you might have a flip into less, and especially less huge, but the people themselves are going to struggle for a long time. And then at the same time, you have a pressure. And just like the people in the teams, who now suddenly in the teams, also management has a trouble. Obviously, they might say, less is great, let's do less, but they don't really, they still need the time to translate this into what it means in reality. So I've noticed in less adoptions, a very harmful practice of creating feature teams and then introducing tools to measure teams and the performance of the teams in order to make sure that there is a performance. And imagine you're just entered into less and you have a single backlog. And so everybody's supposed to work on the most important stuff. And some teams are clearly going to have a big trouble to actually deliver anything because they're just barely formed. And remember the problem of previously they were doing all kinds of bullshit, suddenly need to focus on the most important. That's going to take a long time before they adjust the situation. How does it look in reality? Well, those teams don't deliver anything or deliver very little. And so imagine the management, which is looking at the teams, which suddenly doesn't do anything, seemingly. And so basically they stop doing the bullshit. But people don't really realize it was bullshit. So they see that teams are not doing much. So they start to freak out, start to put pressure, start to introduce all kinds of coordination meetings to make sure there are checks and balances. Why is this team not working properly? And pressuring the Scrum Master to make sure the teams is actually performing, and so on and so on. So it becomes, in less adoptions, becomes this weird double thing, which is continuously balancing, where obviously you want to balance it out so that the line goes up and this pressure needs to be really reduced. And so we need to start to be comfortable with the teams doing nothing. And this is really crucial, and that it shouldn't be a problem for teams doing nothing. I mean, it sounds incredible. We're supposed to have this high performance blah, blah, blah stuff. But the real lesson and the real skill that we need to learn is how to do absolutely nothing. And what does it mean, nothing? It means that you start to open your eyes and start to see what's really going on. So that you, by definition, refuse to do bullshit tasks. And that we start to see when something is bullshit. And then take time to figure out how to do real useful work, which is from a single backlog, which is properly prioritized, where the most important things are there, where we help and contribute to each other. And typically, when you help somebody else who's doing really important work, makes your work also immediately not bullshit one anymore. And so we need to start to be comfortable with that. And yeah, this is a clip from The Office Space, brilliant movie. So, so it takes time, it takes patience, and in less adoptions, definitely fail from time to time, and this is one of the core reasons why they fail. Because I hope you get a sense of what kind of a pain are we touching, and when introducing less, and it might, in your current engagement, your current company that you are involved with and are trying to do less, it might not change much by trying to make a difference of getting rid of the bullshit stuff, but it will be the next one. So my satisfaction of introducing less is not directly and not primary to help the company, but is to help the people in the company. So, and then hopefully that's going to result into something positive for the current product development group, but otherwise, hopefully for the next one. So questions time. Alexei.
We are here.
Oh, Evgeny.
Yeah, so thanks, Victor. I'm now puzzled because I guess like many of us have been contributing to the
Bullshit job.
bullshit jobs and bullshit reality, right?
Yeah.
And, like somewhat to start, right? Like, how do you think like coaches or external consultants should and should not behave to not to contribute to this thing, right? Because as an external consultant, you typically asked to produce something, right? To produce presentations, do assessment, come up with a plan or a roadmap or a transformation on and whatnot. And that typically falls into one of your categories, right? Like how you approach that. Let's maybe go a bit personal. How you approach that as a consultant, not to contribute to that.
So I've been involved in corporate investment banking as a coach. They on the first conversation interview that I got, they said, we already advanced in Agile. We just need somebody who replaced the old Agile coach, and you need to make sure that the teams are assessed, and so we need to make a head office happy and stuff, etc. So I basically immediately in the intake said, I will not do any kind of a reporting to the head office. And they were kind of confused, flabbergasted. And so immediately started to be attention. And then one of the guys who were sitting in intake says, I'll take care of that for you. It was a manager. And then, how do you deal with that? Yeah, there's a lots of I guess smaller tips and tricks. There is not single one. You need to be very clear on your own view and approach, on your own vision of how the whole Agile transformation looks like. The more you're clear on that, the more you take charge and set a vision, the more you're going to be listened at. So if you are at the mercy of organization which puts you in a box of what Agile coaching or Scrum Master means, then you're basically lost. There is not much you can do. You can hope that there is somebody else who actually takes care of that problem for you. But the more you put yourself in a vision position, then the more they're going to listen. And that's actually relatively easy, because usually in organizations there is a lack of vision. What the heck does it really mean to become agile? There's too much of a blah blah. So if you have a very clear picture, it becomes somewhat easier. And then you also always need to replace with something practical. So for example, if somebody asked me, can you produce a report on Agile maturity assessment? Then I would go, I would invite the manager to come to the group. And I would make it very strong point of that. And usually maybe use my bit of a Dutch background by being very direct. If you really want to know how it's going on, you will come to the product development group, and I will show you and spend time showing you what is actually really happening. You're going to learn much more than from any kind of a report. And so, yeah, so there's this kind of a stuff. And does it always work? No, sometimes I also need to compromise, and sometimes I also need to tick a box. Okay, that happens. And but that's a way to kind of move it forward. Education helps also enormously, because without being so direct, it's much easier to do it in a training. So if you in the beginning first focus on a training, and so you set a stage in a training. So secretly in my training, I'm basically conditioning people for how they need to look at me. So I'm misusing the training to position myself.
All right, thanks for that.
Thanks for that. There is a very nice question in the chat from Mark. So you spoke a lot about the scaling organization and saying that in a large organization there are a lot of bullshit jobs. So what is the benefit of the large organizations to small organizations? So there are definitely some benefits there. So in comparison to.
Yeah, the fact that so let's maybe focus on a large product development organizations. It seems pretty clear that that very large product development organizations are just a waste. They really don't need to be so large. That's if we kind of look at generically. So most of them just need to be much smaller. In that sense, there is not much use to it. But there are certain products which do require quite a lot of teams to deliver a product, and still it's never in the thousands or something. So although there are so many product development organizations which are going into thousands, there are people who say like you can deliver any product with one team. That's nonsense. You cannot. There are products which require many more teams simply because product is complex, such as I was involved in autonomous driving, and so that cannot be done with one or few teams. You really need more people to do that.
The other good question is, right, is about, do you have the experience with 50+ Scrum teams, less huge or kind of less huge organization, which is still flat? So like it doesn't have a lot of hierarchical levels.
Cool. Yes, I have experience with more than 50 teams. Is it flat? Yes, but it's actually not a good idea. Yes and no. I mean, the organization itself is not flat, but the product development part was flat, and was actually flat, and they changed back a bit, and because it's in a sense that they reduced massively amount of managers, and that's in a large scale not a good idea to do it so fast, and so I would be careful with that. Simply, one of the reasons is people are not used to working with so few managers suddenly, and so there is some adjustment period. Second reason, much more important reason, is that the distance between management and product development becomes even larger. So simply because of the scope that you need to cover. So one manager suddenly needs to be at Gemba for 20 teams. What most likely what will happen is they're not going to be Gemba at all. It's going to be so much busy with all kinds of stuff that no time for Gemba. So that's.
So you saying that like if it's better not to go in such scale and keep the product like this, so it's better try to manage this in a much smaller scale, right?
I don't understand what you mean. Can you?
So you're saying that you fairly say that it's not a good idea to go in such big scale because you will lose the product focus, and that's going to be hard to go to Gemba, or what? Like
no, I mean the question was what are you when having so many teams and then also flat structure. Flat structure meaning you have a very few managers.
Yeah,
the problem
like
is,
couple of.
Yeah, a couple of managers, and you have let's say you have 4 managers for 80 teams or something.
Yeah.
What will happen is that those managers will not have time for Gemba.
To go to every team.
Well, the problem is, so they're going to have a very hard time to understand what the heck is going on. It's just too much.
Is it good or bad? Maybe they shouldn't understand. So if you're saying like,
that depends enormously on how functional the whole structure is. So if you just switch into less, it's very likely they're not used to that yet. So you're going to have a massive amount of problems simply because teams do not become self-managing teams overnight. It takes years.
Yeah, sure.
So what do you do in the meantime? And so in the meantime, you have this huge gap where the management doesn't have time to go to Gemba, and the teams are not really self-managing. You're going to have a massive amount of problems. And so the problems are who's going to pick them up, who's going to take care of them. So it becomes chaotic, and that's a bit dangerous.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah,
that's true. During the first months of less adoption, do we first focus more on delivering down increment than on value? For example, creating new product having many dependencies in legacy system and organizations. Like, I'm not sure what is the question. So wherever we focus more on CI/CD in technical stuff rather than
fluency thing, right? So do you focus before to help organization to learn how to deliver, and once they know how to deliver, then you optimize value? Like, do you see like any sequential approach to that, Viktor?
Yeah. So generally, I would focus on learning how to deliver first. So typically, CI/CD indeed it should be the first priority. Yes, because I mean, we need to be aware of that. Despite all this talk about organizational stuff that needs to be put in place, etc., the real reason why product development fails, in my view, after 20 plus years, is actually the quality of the development. And so generally design, the coding, code quality, etc. This is the manifestation of it. So typically before you had all kinds of dysfunctions which created problems in design, problems in code, problems in architecture. It becomes a mess. And then you suddenly switch into less, but the problems are still there in the code. And so if you don't have a mechanism, a very disciplined mechanism, and start dealing with those problems, the rest is going to be pointless, basically. You end up with the feature teams which are not able to deliver much anytime soon, which creates a very painful situation. So CI/CD becomes a really #1 priority. And but vice versa is also true. So do you need to clean up the architecture before you start doing less? No, because the very reason why the architecture was a mess in the first place is usually because the teams don't have a whole product focus. So you need feature teams to actually clean up stuff.
Okay, I think this is the last question, guys, right? So we are going to go to the break. Yeah. That's the 8-minute break till 00, right? Till 5 p.m. Kiev time or 4 p.m. Berlin time. So
yeah, Viktor, thank you so much for spending your evening with us.
Thank you for having me.
Something to think of. A quick one: do you know any other books or literature on this topic, bullshit jobs and stuff, or that's the only one which you actually came across?
Yeah, I can't think of one, but there are definitely more of this stuff. I mean, I like this one because there's obviously lots of lean stuff, etc., waste and so on, which is kind of in a similar area. But I like this one because of the brutality of the term, and so and the writer and how direct it talks about it.
It's quite brutal. You sent me the description, and I was like,
yeah.
Let's have it. But people say very straightforward without sugarcoating. Thanks a lot. Yeah. A great talk. Thank you. So I guess
you're welcome.
Appreciate it. Yeah. Thank you so much. Have a great evening.